Welcome to the Alain Guillot podcast, the podcast about life, leadership, and money matters. Our guest today is Fiona Hill. Fiona grew up in a small mining town in England. Being aware of the lack of opportunities in a dying town and a dying industry, her father told her, "Go away. There's nothing for you here." And away she went. She studied in Moscow and at Harvard University, became a US citizen, and she served under three different US presidents, President Bush, President Obama, and President Trump. And now she shares the lessons she learned in her book, There is Nothing for You Here, Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. Fiona, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, Alain. It's a real pleasure to be with you.
So I've been reading your story, and of course, I love this kind of story from a place that there is very little opportunity. There is a dark future ahead. People are making fun of you because of your accent, of where you come from, this and that. And then you moving throughout the social ladder, getting a better education, traveling to different places, expanding your horizons, and then getting to advise different presidents in the United States. So it's not from rags to riches, which is the story that we see in Hollywood, but from nowhere to perhaps the place with the highest power in the world. So I like to start by you telling us about your early years when you were 13, you were going to school, and you start telling us about a school trip that you took and how inadequate you felt.
Yes, much of my path from where I began to where I've ended up was through education. I think that's a really big part of the story. And I, as a kid, looked for every educational opportunity that I could find. And I was very lucky that my parents obviously encouraged me in this. And when I was 13, I signed up for a school exchange between my region in the northeast of England, a place called County Durham, and a town in the southern part of Germany, in a place called Tübingen, which is in the region of Baden-Württemberg in the southern part of Germany. And this was an exchange for kids from schools around the whole of my region. And some of the schools were private schools. Some of the schools were very well-known schools. My school was really one of the worst schools in the whole region in terms of the resources that it had and in terms of its academic attainment, because it was a relatively new school with not much of a track record for people studying more academic subjects. And when I first arrived on the exchange, some of the other students asked me three questions. Where was I from? I mean, obviously I was from the same region, but which town was I from? What did my father do? And which school did I go to? And immediately on the basis of those three questions and my answers, they decided who I was and whether it was even worth speaking to me. As my hometown of Bishop Auckland, people knew had hard times. Most of the industry closed down, and most people living in Bishop Auckland were working class, blue collar, manual workers. My father had in fact been a coal miner, and he lost his job as a coal miner, like many other people, like most people who worked in the coal mines in my region. And then he'd become a hospital porter, an orderly, an auxiliary worker in a hospital, one of the lowest jobs in the hospital, along with cleaners and cooks. And my school, Bishop Barrington Comprehensive School, people knew by its negative reputation. So immediately, many of the people on the exchange, some of the other students decided, oh, well, if that's who she is, I don't want to really bother getting to know her anymore. And throughout my early part of my life in the United Kingdom, those three questions were always asked by people, and they made assumptions on who I was and what I might become based on those answers to the questions. In fact, they decided that I was nobody worth getting to know. That wasn't the case for everybody, I have to say. But immediately when you're 13 and people ask you these questions and then you see that reaction, you get a strong message that somehow you don't belong.
Okay, and can you tell us why coming from this community, you had a mindset of wanting to improve your education. You wanted to hit the books. You were not into, I guess, drinking or whatever things people do in small little towns. You had this mindset. And how can we expand that same mindset to people that today they are so obsessed about being a star in social media and earning
Hmm.
likes and this and that, as opposed to maybe getting an education?
Yeah, look, I think it was also the time and the community that I was born in, and obviously my family. My family saw that education could be a pathway to a different life. There had been some of my extended family, distant cousins, who had done well at school and had gone on to different jobs. And my father had always felt that he had been deprived of an education. When he was 14, he went down into the coal mines. But he was somebody who'd actually enjoyed school. He liked learning things. And at the time when he went into the mines, this is in the late 1940s, about 1946 or 1947, after the war, after World War II, the local miners' union, the Durham Miners Association, actually used some of its money to help miners continue their education. And that might be more qualifications on the job, but it might be more, studying things. And so my dad had taken advantage of the opportunities through the Durham Miners Association to learn about things. He would go to lectures and he would kind of read books that they recommended. There were other people who were interested in sketching and painting, and some of them became very famous artists through these miners' clubs, these miners' societies. My mother had gone to train as a nurse at 16 and had become a midwife delivering babies. And in the town that I was in, people still thought that education could really get you somewhere, even if the overall community wasn't doing well. Education was an opportunity to maybe do something else. The problem was that there were no jobs in my town. So the understanding was if you did get an education, after you finished school and you got other qualifications, as the title of the book says, there's nothing for you here. You'd have to move and go somewhere else. So already my parents were accepting that if I did get the education that they wanted me to have, that they would have liked to have had, I would have to move and go somewhere else to get the education, and then basically to find a job. So already they're always encouraging me to emigrate, in the sense, from out of my region, which was very close knit, and to go as far as I could to find opportunity.
Okay, well, now I have a question about England itself. And you open your book talking about England's position in the world, and especially during the time period of Margaret Thatcher. But I would like to ask you also a time period before that, considering that at one time England was the biggest empire in the world. How come all the British people are not rich? How come there is that much poverty in your little town, and how come there is so many people still lacking uh, education or resources? I mean, we could ask the same questions about the United States, that at one time, now it's declining a little bit, but one
Yeah.
time it was the most powerful nation in the world, and people still live in absolute poverty. So, I mean, of course, I don't expect you to have the answer for this difficult question, but I wonder what comes to your mind.
Well, it's interesting because you're sitting in Montreal in Canada. Canada is one of the more equal societies in the world. And of course, at one point, a long, long time ago, Canada was also part of that British Empire and then the British Commonwealth.
Let me
But
interrupt you on that.
yeah,
I became a Canadian citizen and I had to pledge allegiance to the Queen. So I don't know
yes,
what my
exactly.
status is right now, but I know that I swear allegiance to the Queen of England. So
Yes, because
okay.
she's still the head of state technically, for parts of countries that are part of the British Commonwealth. That's right. But look, England has always been a very unequal, or rather, Great Britain, the United Kingdom, has always been an unequal society, and things got much worse during the Industrial Revolution because of the nature of of employment, when people were employed in heavy industries, coal mining, steelworks, shipyards, and the railway sector, for example. The private owners, ran many of these industries as kind of single company entities, and people lived in company accommodation. Everything was paid for by the company. There were company towns, or people worked for the company. And even then, and wages were kept quite low in that time frame as well. There's no mystery about, many of the books talking about changing labor relations and the rise of labor unions, and people like Karl Marx, writing about British industry and predicting revolution, was based on a reading of this huge inequality between the workers and the very rich owners of factories and enterprises. But over time, Britain evolved. It didn't have a revolution, a social revolution, but it did have a lot of social change to try to bridge the gaps of inequality and improve conditions. And after World War II, all of these big industries were nationalized by the government because of the devastation of World War II to the economy. Britain had to rebuild itself in the late 1940s. And private owners didn't have the assets to rebuild these industrial sectors, so the government took them over. I mean, they had, professional technocratic managers, but it was really, they were owned by the state. And in the 1980s, when Margaret Thatcher comes into office as Prime Minister, these state-run sectors of the economy, shipbuilding, steel, coal, the railways, the electricity grid, all of these larger entities, they were not very efficient, and they needed to be modernized and to move into the new automation sector. And many of them need to be downsized because they weren't competitive. And this was a huge undertaking. And when this privatization took place, there wasn't any thinking about what happened to the people who were working in these big industries. There was an assumption that all of them would be able to find new jobs, or that they would move. And as we all know, from growing up in specific communities and areas, people have family ties, and lots of people don't have any assets of their own to enable them to move. I mean, as an immigrant, how difficult it is to move. And essentially, hundreds of thousands of people, where I was in the north of England, because it was the center of the Industrial Revolution and all of the heavy industry, they lost all of their jobs at once. There wasn't a major private sector that people could move to jobs to in the region. And all of the new positions in finance and services and the new economy was somewhere else in the United Kingdom. People didn't own their houses. My parents had actually bought their house, but all of their assets were in the house. They couldn't sell it to go somewhere else. People didn't have qualifications apart from for these heavy industrial jobs that they did. Their education might have stopped, like my father at 14. My mother actually, as a nurse, had a better time of this, but she stopped working when she had children because there was no childcare. But many of the people were simply stuck where they were. They couldn't find a job because they couldn't move to get a job. And the interesting thing is, it was easier for people to move to Australia or Canada or the United States to emigrate completely than to find another job in terms of the United Kingdom. So my region, everybody lost their jobs all at the same time. There's no other new employment. All of the jobs are in the south, in London or some other place far away where nobody knows anyone. They don't have any information, and they don't have even the money to get there. And so many people some people in my family emigrated to Australia in that time frame because the Australian government wanted workers, and they paid their way on an airplane and gave them information about new jobs in Australia. And so many of my relatives, my father wanted to move to America to do something similar, to work in coal mines, but he couldn't take my grandparents with him, and he was responsible for looking after his parents. So lots of people got stuck for different reasons in places where there was no longer any employment. And as a result of that, everybody became very poor because the shops closed, because there was nobody had money to spend things in the shops apart from basic food. The tax base of the town was diminished because there was, no generation of extra capital and revenues for the towns. Nothing got repaired. It was a vicious circle that we see all the way around the world.
Wow. Okay. Well, I can understand that it becomes easier to move to a different country to somewhere else in England, especially that you highlight the importance of classes, different classes. And if you are born in, it's almost like in India, the different caste system. And if you are
Exactly. It's
born in
very
a,
similar.
and when an immigrant from England comes to, let's say, Canada, at least they say they are white, not
Yes, exactly.
they
And they
say
speak
they're
English.
yeah,
Yeah,
which put them at a higher level than, I don't know, the Native Americans that have been here for
right.
thousands of years. But okay, uh, uh, this is not an economics podcast, but in a situation like this, which is a global economy, let's say a shipbuilding in England that now is competing against a shipbuilder in South Korea, which have lower labor costs, what is there to do? I mean, that is something that even a good union cannot even save, because there is an international
Exactly.
market going on. So what is the solution for people who has been misplaced because their industry is no longer competitive?
Well, there's two different sorts of solutions. One is to think about the place itself. Can you bring in new work through investment or maybe some state intervention, or is there some other way of stimulating the economy? And the other is, of course, to move, to give people, however, the means to move, qualifications. So, changes in the education, investment in further education, new skills, to be learned, but then also some funds to enable them to move. I mean, in a way, that's what the Australian government did when they tried to recruit workers from England in the 1960s and 70s. They gave them the means to move and information, and then there were training programs when people got there to learn new jobs. So there's that intervention, but revitalizing the places is very difficult. And I write in the book about many attempts that were made in the north of England to bring in new jobs. And it was usually by giving companies tax breaks for a short period of time. So they wouldn't pay any tax. And that meant, of course, that the towns and cities didn't have any revenues either, because they had to invest in new facilities for new companies, because they're not going to move into old coal mines or into old steelworks unless you remake everything. We had lots of new light industrial estates, in other words, new buildings that were built for new companies. The region had to invest in those, spending money that it didn't have, and then it wouldn't take any taxes or very limited taxes in the first several years. And often what would happen is a new industry would then, once the tax incentives, the tax breaks had gone, would move somewhere else, because they were looking for also cheaper labor costs. And initially the labor costs were high because people had had reasonably good jobs previously in mining or in the steelworks or in other factories. And so what we saw in my area over and over again was a new industry would come in, a new industry would leave, and then all the buildings would decay again, and they'd have to do something else to bring others in. So what happened recently in my hometown, this is after decades of decay, as a major individual philanthropist has decided to invest in the town because it has all the potential to become a tourist destination. It has a Roman fort because the town was part of the outer rim of the Roman Empire for 300 years, which is amazing to think about, really, because it's sort of just south of Hadrian's Wall, the wall that was built, to keep the Scots out of the rest of Roman Britain. It has some ancient churches, a kind of complex of a castle and a palace. And for some strange sets of reasons, it has a lot of famous paintings from some Spanish artists. Somehow there were, connections in the past, and a lot of old buildings in its marketplace that have never been pulled down because there was no money to build something new. So the investor has put money into rejuvenating the town and then getting other people to join in. So it also shows that it takes a big infusion of time and money and commitment to turn somewhere around. In other towns and cities, there might have been a company, a business, a private business that's still there, that then becomes part of a local development effort, with the local governments, and they invest. But the basic message is you always need to have some form of investment from the government, from a private benefactor. And sometimes communities can raise money themselves, but that's very hard. So each place has a different problem. And it's
Right.
not so easy to regenerate the place, and certainly not enough to find jobs for everyone. But in the book, I try to talk about some of this that I've seen myself in different places and how much it takes to move ahead, because not everyone can move, right? I
Right.
mean, I'm
Right.
sure when you moved as an immigrant, there were still people left behind. It wasn't like everybody moved with you.
Right. Okay. Well, I'm here where I'm living. I mean, Canada is only 2% of the global economy, so it's
Right.
tiny. It's smaller than the state of California. Here, my neighbor, for example, she's being paid by the government the equivalent of 2,000 US dollar per month to go back to school because
Right.
her skills became obsolete. And so this is a in comparing to England or to US, this is a small economy, yet this government is investing in its people,
That's right.
investing, relocating, retooling, trying to make sure that no matter what's the new industry coming up, the citizens are prepared. And the thing that astonished me is that in a place that have so much wealth, I mean, the United States spent, I don't know, $1 trillion in Afghanistan. How come they couldn't spend some of that money in educating their population? And they probably wouldn't have some of the political and terrorists and I consider ignorant problems that they're having because people believe all these conspiracy theories they see in the internet.
Well, I completely agree with you. It's one of the reasons why I wrote the book,
Thank you.
because I know that myself, I benefited from these kinds of grants and fellowships. So as a child from a low income, a very low income family, my local education authority acted a little bit like the Canadian government. They paid for my education to go to college. But a lot of that money has disappeared now. It was there in the 1980s when I went, and I graduated without any educational debt, which is a huge problem now for people like me in the United States and the United Kingdom, because those kinds of grants, those investments in their future education have disappeared. People think that the individual has to do it themselves. It's not an investment in their population and in society. It's all on the individual because they're the only person who benefits from it. And that's just not true, as you've said. And that's recognized in all major advanced countries, with the exception of perhaps the United States and the United Kingdom, which used to invest in society as well. The United States invested in its population after World War II and in the 60s and 70s until really the kind of late 80s and 90s. And the same happened in the United Kingdom. The idea that a person had to just take on debt for their education because only they would benefit for it really took hold. And even now there's resistance to expanding the payments for education, further educational retraining, because the feeling is only an individual benefits, where you, rightly so, that society, we all benefit from it. And companies, the private sector benefit from it because they need qualified workers. And, so it could easily be in the United States having the big manufacturing companies and the government work together. Basically the companies cover some of the costs of retraining, the government covers, and it could be local government, not just the federal government. Canada, the Canadian model could be replicated by some of the United States individual states. The United Kingdom isn't a very big country. I mean, it would be more feasible, to do this in the United Kingdom. And the tragedy of the UK is that until Brexit, a lot of this funding was available for retraining, but it came from the European Union.
Wow.
So I talk in the book about my own relatives who had funding to retrain. My mother's godson, who's like my brother, he worked in a shipyard. The shipyard closed, and then he had a mixture of funding from the European Union, British shipbuilders, and then later from a company he started to work for. He didn't pay much himself at all to completely retrain. and also take a university degree through something called the Open University, which is Britain's biggest public university. And you do that part-time while you're working. I mean, those kinds of models can be replicated in many places or expanded. And you said exactly what I think as well, that this would really benefit the longer term political development of the United States as well, because people are watching what's happening in the United States from the outside and are really shocked that there's so much fighting among the population. And education has become a dividing line of class, politics, culture, values, which for me, having come to the United States to be educated and winning this amazing scholarship in 1989, I can't believe it. I don't, I know what's happened, but at the same time, I'm shocked.
Okay, there's something about you. I mean, all your accomplishment come from the desire to continue improving yourself. I wonder before, because we're running out of time, if you could give us a tip on having this hunger and desire to constantly do better for self-improvement. And we have talked about education, but there are so many other ways to keep this positive mindset that I can improve myself and I can help the world around me if I can just improve 1% a year, just to say something.
Yeah, and I still feel it. I mean, I'm in my 50s now, but I still feel I need to learn more. I need to improve. I need to get more skills. The world is changing all the time. And I think it's because I experienced very young, like you did, this rapidly changing world where nothing was guaranteed and nothing was given. Everything was uncertain. My father, by the time I was born, had already had 5, 6 different jobs, and he was only in his 30s. All of the coal mines he worked in, he had several, kept closing down. Then he went to work in a brickworks, then he went to work in a steelworks, and then he came to work in the hospital. And every time he was unemployed, he was always looking for something to do. He didn't take money from the state, the dole, unemployment. He always tried to work. And all my family were like that. They always wanted to keep on working and keep on doing things. And I think that shaped me, obviously. I had so many jobs. I cleaned. I saw pictures of you, that you had when you were, cleaning. And I mean, I did all of that. I worked in restaurants and bars and shops and just everything that I could, to basically look after myself and to get myself educated and to keep on moving along. And I think everybody has to realize that we're not going to get anything in this world without hard work. But we also there's so many things we don't know. The more I know, I don't know. And I want to learn. And I also want to give back to people who helped me, because the other important message that I had, and maybe you would agree with this, is that nobody does anything alone. Every time I've had a success, it's because somebody else has helped me. Either they told me about an opportunity or they actively helped me to make it happen. I talk in the book about when I got a new job and I didn't have enough money for proper work clothes. One of the older ladies I was working with took me and bought me a suit. And she said, don't pay me back, just, go on and, be successful. But the message was help other people out as you go along. So for everybody who helped me, I feel an obligation to help others as well. So I'm thinking also, having written this book, what more can I do? It's not just about national security and foreign policy where I worked in, but our society's in a crisis.
Right.
What can I do to try to help? And I look at Canada and think, well, there's, what are the Canadians doing that are right? Or what is being done right, in Europe or elsewhere? What lessons can we learn from other places? And I can learn and try to see if we can make things happen in the same way in the US and, hopefully also in the UK where, I used to live.
Okay, you are trying to pay it forward. Okay,
Pay
Fiona,
it forward, exactly.
can you tell us one more time the title of the book and where can the listeners follow the work that you continue doing?
Well, the book is called There's Nothing for You Here, which is what my father said to me in 1984. But the subtitle is much more encouraging. It's Finding Opportunity in the 21st Century. And I mean, the book's available in all the typical places that books are available, but I'm continuing with the work of thinking about finding opportunity with my colleagues at the Brookings Institution in Washington, DC, where, I work full time. And there's a lot of research going on on these very topics at the Brookings Institution. The question is just how can we put it into practice, not just think about it, how can we actually do something?
And is there a place where the listeners can follow you?
Through Brookings, the Brookings Institution. Yeah, I don't, I'm afraid I'm not a big fan of social media. I love podcasts and I think this is great that you're doing this, but I think that, Twitter, Facebook have caused a lot of problems.
You're not
So I
out there.
tend to combine things, to podcasts and, stuff through Brookings.
Well, Fiona, thank you so much for your time.
Thank you so much, Alain. It's a real pleasure.